Standing at the end of the age of awakening and speculation, and at the cusp of the age of faith and reason, are the towering figures of Boethius and Augustine. These are transitional figures in the sense that they both have absorbed, sort of distilled, what you might think of as the best of what the ancient world had to offer in terms of its classics, its philosophy, its poetry, and so forth. And they begin to synthesize this with the nascent Christian theology that they were developing. And so they stand at the beginning of a period that is going to be marked by precisely this kind of synthesis for a good 1,000 years and beyond. I want to look at Boethius to begin with, and I want to start with his masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy. So let me just say something quickly about the literary impact of The Consolation of Philosophy and the form and the content or the substance of this work. So The Consolation of Philosophy is divided into 5 books, each of which has sections of philosophical prose and of poetry. And they're all reflective of the immersion that Boethius had in the classics, in the best of the Roman and Greek poetry that he'd learned in his early days. As to its content, The Consolation of Philosophy begins in a sort of autobiographical way, displaying the life situation of Boethius himself and the struggles that he was having in the period in which he wrote it. So I'm going to have to say something about Boethius, the man, in his life, so that we can make our way into The Consolation of Philosophy. So Boethius, well, he was born to a very privileged family in the 4th century. He was the son of a Roman consul, and although his father died fairly early on in his youth, he was then adopted by another Roman consul who occupied an even more privileged position. And so he was able to have the best education on offer in the day, and he himself became acquainted with the political life of Rome during this very turbulent period, but became an important fixture in the Roman Senate. So he was a man very early on who was made consul. He was a man who was respected for his learning and for his integrity. And it looked as though he was having among the best lives one could have. Well, fortunes changed. As you recall, this is a very turbulent period in the history of Rome, and Rome itself was under the rule of the king Theodoric of the Ostrogoths. Long story short, Boethius is eventually charged unjustly by this king of treasonous activity, among other charges. And so what happens is this dramatic fall from grace, where Boethius is stripped of his titles, stripped of his possessions, cast into prison, awaiting execution, where he eventually was executed by bludgeoning. So as Boethius is awaiting this ignominious execution there in prison, he takes up his pen and he writes The Consolation of Philosophy. So in this story, Philosophy, who is personified by a noble woman, Lady Philosophy, comes to visit Boethius there in his jail cell and confronts him as he's bemoaning his condition and is overtaken with grief and so forth. And in a way, she chastises him kindly and tells him, look, you've got to remember all that I've already taught you. It was very easy to learn all these philosophical lessons about how to find happiness, what your destiny is, and so forth when your life is going well. When the wheel of fortune spins and your fortunes change, however, that's the real test. Are you going to keep on with what you've learned and put your money where your mouth is, or are you going to be betrayed as being a sort of fair weather philosopher? And so Lady Philosophy begins to speak and offer her consolation by way of reminding him all that he had learned. Now, What had he learned? Well, you can see some definite connections between what Boethius says, what Lady Philosophy reminds him of by way of consolation, and what the Stoic philosophers had said. There's definite Stoic influences in Boethius's thought. So he's reminded that despite external circumstances over which you have no genuine control, you still have a sphere of influence over your own volition that can express your own self-control, and no one can take away your happiness from you, despite external circumstances, if the mind is fastened rightly upon that which truly causes happiness. There's also an Aristotelian connection. You'll recognize as you read that he begins with this discussion of the highest good, the summum bonum for human beings. Like Aristotle, Boethius argues, Lady Philosophy reminds him, that your highest good has got to be something that is of value in itself and not merely of instrumental value. So all of the elements of fickle fortune, fame, health, wealth, possessions, and the like, those things aren't what your true or highest value or happiness consists in, and all of these things are beyond your control anyway. Whether the supreme good in which your happiness exists is something that is of value in itself and something which can't be taken away from you once you're rightly related to it. Now, this is where Boethius's Christianity begins to come into play. I should mention that Boethius never explicitly mentions any Christian doctrine. He doesn't explicitly deploy any Christian ideas. I think it's important to Boethius to demonstrate here that just by the right use of reason alone, you can come to the consolation that philosophy has to offer, but there's no mistaking the fact that what the right use of reason actually leads you to is something that synthesizes very well with Boethius's Christian worldview. So how does his Christianity impact or synthesize with the ancient learning that philosophy, Lady Philosophy, is reminding him about? Well, in a couple different ways. The highest good is happiness, but happiness is to be identified with God or with the love of God. So your supreme good lies in God himself and in the beatific vision that comes with communion and love of the divine being. Moreover, he tweaks, he alters the notions of fortune, of fate, and so forth in a distinctively Christian direction. So you'll remember that for the Stoics, they did argue that the entire universe, the history of the world, is determined. It's an expression of the rational will of Zeus. And remember what that means for them is that the way that the world is the only way it could be. The way things happen must happen this way. And so the sort of Stoic response is to find contentment and acceptance in this, a sort of acquiescence. Okay. Boethius takes up something like that outlook, but he provides an additional level. He's not thinking of fate or fortune as being the fundamental thing. He is concerned that fortune often does appear arbitrary and unjust. The innocent suffer, the wicked prosper, and we're led to distress and despair and confusion through this. So if all you've got is sort of fortune, the wheel of fortune spinning and changing, and then you just tell yourself, well, this is the way that it had to be, I might as well acquiesce to it, that's not the most satisfying response to a very deep and perplexing question. So Boethius says, look, the wheel of fortune itself is under the reign, under the control of divine providence. But here's where another difference comes in. The world is a rational place. It reflects God's wisdom and rationality and so forth, but it's not necessitated. It's not determined in the sense that it couldn't be any other way than the way that it is. To the contrary, according to Boethius, God has created the world freely through a free expression of love and made it this way, but could have made it other ways. So what that means for him is that things didn't have to be this way, but they are organized. They are preordained to follow a certain path in the way that they are, out of not just God's rationality, but out of God's love and benevolence. So what he's thinking here is this: the externally arbitrary and unjust motions of fortune look that way to us, but there is an overarching level where fortune itself is set spinning at the behest of divine providence, which is itself ordered towards God's own will and the good of each individual creature. So that means that even though we experience turmoil, distress, seemingly unjust states of affairs, those things are, as a matter of fact, ordered towards our own good, ordered towards our own eternal benefit. So you will go on after your death and so forth, again, over and against the Stoics, but fortune itself is not the sort of bottom level to which we must acquiesce or find acceptance within. Rather, divine providence and divine love is the order of the day. Okay, so this leads right away to a kind of problem. I might think this sounds good. The Christian element in Boethius's philosophy allows him to take what's good about Stoicism, but say something a little bit more satisfying about the overall history and shape of the world than what they were able to do. He also takes what seems good about Epicureanism, in particular the idea that our destinies are in some sense in our hands, okay? So here's what I have in mind. When Boethius takes up the Stoic idea that, there's a measure of freedom that comes from your internal control over your own volitions and the way that you accept what fortunes you've been handed, that's only part of the story with respect to free will. There's got to be more, says the Christian Boethius, to free will than that. And that is because on his Christian outlook, your actions and your choices have eternal repercussions, and they really ought to be understandable as flowing from one's character in a way that grounds personal responsibility for what you do. So Boethius doesn't like the idea that our choices, our actions themselves, are part of fate, are determined in that way. At the same time, he does like the idea that the entire history of the universe is providentially ordered, foreknown by God in all of its details. So the upshot here is that it's sort of twofold. On the one hand, Boethius's Christianity gives him certain tools that help him to sharpen and reform and refocus the best of ancient philosophy, but they also lead to philosophical perplexities or puzzles. And Boethius is quite aware of this. So there's an extended dialogue and set of poems in which Boethius talks with Lady Philosophy about this very problem. He asks the question, look, how is it that if God foreknows everything in its entirety, every single thing that's going to happen, how could things happen any other way than the way that God foreknows they will occur? And if they couldn't happen in any other way, then I couldn't do anything but what God foreknows I will do. So you see, he wants, on the one hand, the goods that he gets from divine providence, the guarantee that comes with it, that the universe isn't arbitrary, that God does have a plan for you, that the turmoil and affliction and the spins of the wheel of fortune that you go through, these are all actually ordained and directed for your own good. At the same time, that looks like it takes away the freedom of the individual. So how can you put these things together? Well, this is a problem, the problem of foreknowledge and freedom, that is a very influential dilemma. It's a dilemma that has sparked a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion, all throughout the medieval era and today. Boethius makes a contribution to this discussion that actually forms something like a standard for much of the Middle Ages and retains some influence today. So the Boethian response begins by saying, no, you actually can have it both ways. And here's how he's going to do it. He says, look, God is a simple being. What that means is God is not composed of any parts, okay? And in particular, God's not composed of any temporal parts. So the notions or the categories of time, temporality, don't apply to God. It doesn't make sense to say that God was, or God is, or God will be this, that, or the other, because just as God is outside space, God is outside of time. Okay? God views the world and lives his life in its fullness in one eternal now, quote unquote. What that means is that for us, we are situated within a timeline, and it makes sense from our perspective to speak of God's foreknowing things. And then we ask these questions, how could the future be any different than what God foreknows it will be? It looks like it's all determined. We can't change it. It's inevitable. But he says, you've got the wrong view of things. Since God is outside of time, strictly speaking, he doesn't foreknow anything. He doesn't know anything ahead of time or before it happens, because all of those are temporal notions. He knows everything, past, present, and future, immediately. So just as if I know that you are sitting in a chair right now, I see that you're sitting in a chair, my knowledge that you're in the chair doesn't impose any necessity on you. It doesn't force you or cause you to sit in the chair. So too, if God knows ahead of time from our perspective that you're going to be sitting in a chair at noon tomorrow, in the same way, his foreknowledge, really, strictly speaking, his eternal, timeless knowledge, imposes no necessity on you either. So you see, you've got with this view that God is this simple, timeless being, and also omniscient, you get a reconciliation of human freedom, along with the idea that God not only foreknows the future, but foreknew your future activities and experiences in a way that somehow allowed him to orchestrate all the events of your life towards your own good and for the benefit or the fulfillment of his overall plans.